It gives me a great pleasure to welcome everybody here this afternoon. I'm Javier Klopper from the DaVinci Institute, and in our midst we have a very esteemed guest of us, a well-known person with extensive experience in the field of governance, and I have no doubt that he will push our boundaries this afternoon to think about governance in a different way and almost think beyond governance. So it's an honor to welcome here Dr. Nimrod Mbele. This afternoon that we will facilitate the session. You all saw the invite. I think these days with Google and LinkedIn, we know a lot about our speakers. So the topic, as you can see on the screen, but as part of the introduction, let me give you a quick overview of Mbele and to really understand what powerful individual and influential individual we have here as a thought leader. Really privileged to have him here as one of our mastermind presenters. And in fact, it's our first mastermind series. In the past, we all are familiar with the Curiosita sessions. We decided to give Curiosita a new jacket, change it to a mastermind, and once a month we'll bring in a mastermind to open our minds, to take us in a direction, to help us to go back to work this afternoon or tomorrow and really push the boundaries in much firmer than what we traditionally did. So the mastermind today is Dr. Mbele. So I don't think Dr. Mbele need any further introduction, but as a quick summary, Nimrod's help, and I read from his CV, helps organizational leaders to solve complex and complicated business-related problems in the past by aligning organizational strategies with culture, value policies and procedures to optimize the value for stakeholders and shareholders. And if you go to a familiar website, you can just go and Google 101.9. Dr. Mbele also have a regular, I think Nimrod, in fact, weekly radio show that you do. We also interview many people, so it's no empty words. He really live what he preaches. He's the managing partner at Knowledge Anchor Group. As you can see on the slides, we blend wealth of experience in strategy, consulting, academia, public and private sector operations. And over the past 18 years, I think in various capacities where I'm sitting, he managed large-scale projects for organization in both private and public sector. Nimrod have the privilege in the past to be lecturing and supervising postgraduate students on corporate governance specifically, strategy development, change management, program design, monitoring and evaluations at the Wits School of Governance, also at Regenesis Business School and the Regent Business School, and as we speak here today, also at DaVinci Business School. Nimrod joined the broadcast fraternity as a host of Beyond Governance in 2015 as a thought leader, showing on current affairs with a particular focus on corporate governance. So I cannot think about a better person to speak to about corporate governance than Dr. Mbele. Nimrod's governance and management acumen and insights grew substantially due to the intellectual and practical engagement with incredible captains of industry over a wide range of issues, and you can just follow his podcast to know more about that. I think as one of the many accolades since 2017, Dr. Mbele has been one of the judges on integrated reporting, the Blue Chip Awards, which is co-hosted by PwC, the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, and the Chartered Governance Institute of Southern Africa. And due to his contributions since then, he's also a standing judge for the integrated reporting. As a scholar, Nimrod holds a Bachelor of Arts from Wits University, majoring in political studies, history and sociology. He also obtained his postgrad diploma in management. Then he did a master's degree in management in the field of public policy and development and management, and also a PhD in corporate governance in state-owned enterprises from the School of Governance at Wits, where he played a very prominent role. So over the past 10 years, Nimrod has delivered keynote addresses alongside universal icons in numerous national and international conferences on various leaderships and management topics. So that being said, ladies and gents, we truly have a mastermind in corporate governance, and this afternoon he will talk about the topic in front of you, sharing with us his insights, sharing his ideas. And I've asked Nimrod to do that in the next 20-25 minutes, and then we'll allow a Q&A session. So I will be monitoring the chat, so please post your questions in the chat, and we will be wrapping up at exactly 4:20. And we'll also invite our graphicists in at that point in time, and then we'll conclude at 4:30. But at this point, I don't want to waste any further time and say, Dr. Mbele, I'm really curious about your topic. You know, we honored to have you here this afternoon, and we're looking forward for you sharing your ideas around this important topic of how we can work towards the economic recovery and prosperity in midst of all the applications, challenges, and realities by looking at governance specifically. Dr. Mbele, the honors is ours. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Prof, for that heartwarming introduction. And good evening, colleagues. I would not waste any of your time other than just say thank you very much for being given this opportunity. Hopefully, we will broaden our horizons, and I'm looking forward to have a thought-provoking conversation with yourselves as experts and practitioners in this field. Without any waste of time, the brief that I got from Prof was that obviously I just needed to share my thoughts and views regarding this very complex and complicated phenomenon called corporate governance. I'm deliberately using the word complex and complicated, because when you look at a industry or sector that is complex, the layers are pretty much fewer, and you can predetermine the outputs. And when you're talking of complicated environment, you're now talking about a network of organizations with different ideologies, different interests, different backgrounds, and expectations, and so on and so forth. So these are all issues that when you all put them together in a corporate governance space, may lead to what I define as fractured or fractious governance. And this is just chaos. And the management are actually being given a huge responsibility in some instances when you're talking about private sector to try and make a meaningful sense around this boikos, if you like. Now, the slides that I've just pulled through pretty much gives you a sense of a number of thematic areas which an entity, whether it's in private sector or public sector, needs to really get a sense around. So I would obviously, take you through some of this high level issues with a view to, solicit inputs and points from your end to try and activate a very interesting conversation on this very complex issue. I by no means have the solutions or the answers to this very complex issue. My view is fairly simple, that I need to broaden the horizon and really ask difficult questions. And if you ask difficult questions and invite thought leaders such as yourself, we can all find solutions. The idea is to co-create solutions, because when we are co-creating the solutions, we are more likely to deliver. What comes to mind when you think of corporate governance from a custodian point of view in the private sector, in the main, we have obviously the boards, the boards which are represented by the shareholders, and in some instances, the stakeholders who really decide what needs to happen. We look at Coca-Cola, you look at IBM, you look at Enron, you look at BP, you look at all this major corporation. They all have boards whose role really is to provide not only thought leadership, but strategic guidance and support to management. And typically management is comprised of, as you know, seasoned expertise or experts in various fields, whether it's in finance, whether it's in legal, whether it is in strategy, whether it is in IT, whether it is in mergers and acquisitions. So we now have, obviously, that could already see that it's a very complex and challenge, which the board needs to find a creative ways to ensure that there is a common trajectory, a common purpose, which with a view to ultimately deliver shared value. And the biggest challenge we all seeing in the 21st century and pretty much beyond has been this transition from shareholders' value to shared value. In a previous dispensation, we all knew that we only spoke about the bottom line. Shareholders just wanted the money, irrespective of the precarious operations which have a devastating environmental impact. We're now talking about the ESGs. We're talking huge environmental dangers that we're confronting because of the mishap in terms of how the shareholders were at some point determining the tune without really bearing in mind on the operations of their business activities on the environment. So now we just have to move from shared value, stakeholder shared value. I mean, from a shareholder value to a shared value. So when you think of shared value, which means you pretty much bring everybody into the space, whether it's your client, your business, the stakeholders, your unions, pretty much everyone under the sun has a stake in your entity. But why, if that is the case, if we all, at least at the face value, we have been told that we need all to gravitate toward shared value. And how do we account for the mayhem that we're seeing? I mean, in this country, not so long ago, we've had unpleasant revelations around a number of companies. I mean, for example, when you look at companies such as Stanford, we know Stanford is pretty much one of the interesting case study around corporate governance. And I mean, with share price, we lost close to about 300 billion rands within a very short space of time. And we've had the likes of Tonga Hewlett, with the likes of VBS Bank, with, and the Zondo Commission also brings yet another, insights on why corporations and the public sector organizations the way are not really moving towards shared value. And the transition, the biggest challenge that I've seen in my limited lifespan, if you may, is that we all know what corporate governance is all about, and we have Companies Act, which is very clear in terms of delineation of roles and responsibilities. We have King 4 reports, which is very sound architecture, which guides how corporation ought to be led and managed. And we have OECD frameworks, which also provide insights on how shared value can be created. And yet, we have found ourselves wanting in so many instances, which brings to one question: why is so much fraud happening under the board? Because from a governance point of view, the boards are your custodians. If boards are not able to put together control measures that are balanced, executives will obviously take advantage of the weaknesses of the board. But when you look at boards such as Stanford, these are boards that were made of seasoned tax consultants, seasoned engineers, seasoned financial experts, seasoned mergers and acquisition experts, and so on and so forth. And yet, the corporation lost close to 300 billion rands within a very short space of time. And you look at Tonga Hewlett as another example, a company that has close to 130 years of history in the making. And they were close to what? I mean, they've exaggerated their liabilities for the value of the business with a whooping 1.5 billion raise at some point. And of course, we know what happened to, we all know what happened to VBS Bank. And of course, we all know what happened to Zonal Commission, wherein a number of big corporations were found wanting. It then brings back to one critical issue in my mind, at least not moving away from the role of the board as the custodian, is that how we manage competing interest from a board point of view. Every single person that operates within your entity has interest, and can't be where people sign off declarations of interest, typically before any committee sits, where there's a huge adjudication. You normally find people signing adjudication forms around whether or not they've got the interest. And yet, despite those controls that exist, we still find board members, we still find executives doing business with those entities. And I, part of my discovered at the SABC at some point, of the 9 board members that I had one-on-one with, 7 of them were implicated in doing business with the state, whereas they still had, they've signed a declaration of interest. Then it also made me wonder what could have happened from the board point of view. And I came to a conclusion that when the leadership fails, to send a stern warning to both board members as well as executives, we're already creating a culture of entitlement. You are creating a culture of impunity. If you create a culture of entitlement, you create a culture of impunity, both at the board level as well as within the executive. It will be very difficult for your client, your stakeholders, or your unions to trust. The biggest issue in the midst of our establishment is trust, because there's so much trust that has been eroded at the board level and an executive level and up to management level. So economic recovery, for us to recover from the COVID-19 mayhem, the 10 years of state capture, which has literally downgraded South Africa. When you look at the rating agencies, we're pretty much sitting on a junk status. And the public and private sector level of confidence, when you look at indices, we are pretty much at the bottom. So the recovery has to really be seen through a very decisive action from the leadership. If the board chairperson are seen wanting, as we've seen in most of the state-owned enterprises, when you talk of PRASA, SABC, Eskom, Transnet, and so on and so forth, and we have failed to demonstrate the extent to which we are serious about the culture of impunity, they're serious about the culture of entitlement, we're serious about recovery, we ought to be taking drastic measures. One critical example that I've noticed, you have instances where an official or an executive who has been put on suspension for the longest I've seen was almost 18 months. This is a person who's sitting at the salary band of 3.5 million rands. So times that by 3, and nothing has happened. So we needed to get to a point where if you really want to build trust from the board level, it cannot be that this level of fruitless and wasteful expenditure is being demonstrated by the boards that are not able to take action where they're supposed to be taking action. So that is one biggest issue that we need to really bring back. And you cannot take action. Well, I suppose when the boards and board committees ought to be taking action, our assumption is that those boards and subcommittees, even at executive levels, are led by competent men and women. And it has become a fallacy in most instances for us to take it for granted that some of these boards are driven by meritocracy. And you cannot instill public and private confidence when you are entrusting billions of rands or entities that are managed billions of rands when those that are custodians don't have what it takes. So one biggest thing that is that let's pursue meritocracy. Let's get people that are competent, who are experienced, who know what they're talking about to manage entities. In that way, we're beginning to bring confidence back into the system that this corporation is going to be managed well to a point where bringing value. Earlier on I spoke about the shared value. So we can't have shared values when meritocracy is on the periphery. Meritocracy has to be at the center. The performance standard have to be at the center. We have to get the right people with the right skill competencies and the right culture. As we all know, we are very known to have good policies, good guidelines, good frameworks, and yet we're very weak and found wanting from ethical conduct point of view. So it is important that whoever is driving at an organizational level, you're driving or rebooting, your entity to manage the curve upward. We look at ethics and ethical conduct of those individuals that are heading those. And we cannot look at ethical conduct when it's convenient. We have to be consistent in what we do. And by consistency, I would imagine we start looking from the top, and the chairpersons of the committees, the executives of entities, middle management, junior management, all the way to the bottom. And for us to come back and really inspire confidence, because ultimately it's all about how do we inspire confidence to those that have money to invest and yet are wary of a bottomless pit, which is the case up to so far. So it's quite important that we then have to strengthen the control environment, and our risk assurance has to be very tight. The first line of defense in any corporation, it's your middle management, your senior management, your boards, your board subcommittees, and your board. There's only way in which, if you have a combined risk assurance measures in place, and where there are instances of deviation, we have to be very tough on those particular instances. If we're not, again, we are creating a culture of impunity, because it's all about buddy-buddy system, and which has been prevalent, particularly in the public sector. So the other issue that I wanted to perhaps maybe strengthen or put forward as a way of bringing critical issues to bear is around how do we create an environment that ensures transparency as one of the critical pillars of governance. We have to set, you can only create a transparency by having clearly tight or clearly defined timelines. If you don't have timelines that are clearly tight, and you are chopping, changing willy-nilly, you are likely to be found wanting. And in instances where a decision has to be made on the basis of evidence. Boards, managers make critical decisions based on evidence. If you do not have evidence to justify a particular decision, we may have to go back to the drawing board, but we don't have sufficient evidence to justify this kind of investment. If it's a major acquisition, if it's about capital expenditure, the numbers don't make sense. Let's give us evidence. That's the second biggest thing. The third biggest thing that needs to happen in creating transparency and reinforcing integrity, in my mind at least, is we have to recognize where mistakes have been happening. We have to bring in element of redress. How are we bringing element of redress in instances where we were found wanting? It is important that redress is part and parcel of the formula in ensuring that we drive towards the shared value that I've mentioned. The other biggest issue towards transparency and which reinforce integrity of both the individuals within an organization and organization themselves is how do you manage conflict of interest? You only manage conflict of interest not by dishing out forms for people to complete. You manage conflict of interest by undertaking a detailed, particularly at the high level, live audit of executives, you know, and if an executive lives far beyond his or her means, and that individual has to answer questions, and those questions has to be made clear to the public, you know, because and part of your managing, you know, the lifestyle, as part of the lifestyle audit, you need to make sure that you are targeting senior people. That's where you get the strength of integrity. That's where you draw the strength of trust. That's where the shareholder value begins to find expression. Because if you don't do that, you're focusing on weak or relatively insignificant officials, in inverted commas. You are merely sustaining the corrosion of governance that we've seen it. The reality, colleagues, is that governance environment is literally fractious in its nature. You know, there are no silver bullets. We have the policies, or the procedures, we have the acts, we have guidelines, you name it, you've got them. But these instruments, if you like, do not implement themselves. You need men and women of stature. You need men and women who are ethically sound. So without those particular key drivers, we are very much unlikely to get to an environment where there's shared values that is being pushed. I'll pause for now and take questions if there are any before I conclude, Prof.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mbele. I think there's a number of questions in the chat. Now, I think the one question that definitely we can explore a bit more is and you've kind of touched on that, and it's asked by Prof. Levune, what possible strategies could be applied to curb such malfeasance and benefit of the public and private sector institutions? I think it's probably a little bit more than what we have in the chat, if you can respond to that one.
Yeah, thank you. I didn't get the question. Can you come back again?
What possible strategies could we apply to curb such challenges to the benefit of both public and private sector and the institutions? You know, and I almost want to take one step further and say, to your point, if you have a malfunctioning board or not a strong chair of the board, how do you really benefit the society to make that responsible decisions that you spoke about?
Okay. Ooh.
It's a tough one.
It's a tough one. You know, it's a catch-22 situation, because when you already have people that are within the establishment, you have to manage performance. Performance management system is one way of curbing, particularly on activities that are outside the remit of the organizational strategy. But if you're having to deal with people who come into your environment, you have to have a very clear template. Your background check has to be solid. That's number one, because in that, if you do a thorough background check against all your executives, you are eliminating a lot of issues. Number two, you have to be very strict on your qualifications. Your background check has to be solid. The other biggest strategy that could be put in place is really about how you incentivize people, because if you don't incentivize people, you're more likely to fall trap. So there has to be a very clear remuneration model that disincentivizes people to become unscrupulous in their activities, and have a very set high expectations, which is backed up by a fair and transparent remuneration model. Because if you don't do those kinds of issues, you are likely to be sustain these kind of issues. Easier said than done in a private sector, the chances are, because of fewer actor groups, you're more likely to win. But in the public sector, it's a whole different ballgame. Because decisions are taken on the basis of proximity to power, and politicians are superimposing. It is very difficult. Even instances where we have had jobs for PELs, we have had so many investigations in the public sector, nothing has happened. So that has eroded the public confidence in that. We have commission after commission after commission. It has become a scapegoat in the public sector, instead of addressing the real issues and putting the culprits to book. So those are some of the best ways in which we could address or curb some of mayhems that we see. And the other issue that I think we need to be more brutally honest about is to move away from race-based criteria, and look more on competency-based criteria. Because if you want shared values, we have to grow the economy. If you grow the economy, you're more likely to create opportunities for everybody. So if you were not focusing on key competent people, if you confine your selection pool if you narrow your selection pool, you're not going to create wealth, you're not going to create value, which will in turn create opportunities for other people. So it is important that your recruitment and selection pool is getting bigger, wider and wider. And people should know that for them to be more successful in creating value, the bar is very high. And you can't get the return on investment when the bar is very low.
I really love the practical way that you explain this to us, and how to grow the economy using your words. But I want to circle back. Professor Levuna, you had your hand raised for a while. Do you want to come in here?
Yes, I'm not sure whether you can hear me, because I know my mic has got a challenge. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear, sir. Loud and clear.
Thank you. Dr. Mbele, thank you, Prof. Dr. Mbele, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, Prof.
Indeed. I love the way you have practically expressed how we can cap this. And of course, I've also learned a couple of strategies that can be applied in terms of capping the Maleficence in governance structures of public and private sector institutions. I could have loved also just a comment. I could have loved to add and say, what is the possibility of getting the board members also on the issue of training, and as a method to also professionalize not only the private sector or the public sector officials, but also the governance board members, that is to increase their professionalization in order to cap this issue of malfeasance in the institutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much, Prof. It's a very tough question. The assumption you're making that if you're a custodian of entity, you're already a professional, you have to operate at a particular level, You're not assuming that greater responsibilities when you are still wet behind your ear. It is relatively a lot easier in the public sector when you, for an example, when you're looking at Companies Act, and I think the Schedule 14 or so of the Companies Act, that looks at judgment rule. A judgment rule is becoming more and more pronounced in corporations, in that board members are expected to act with care and diligence, and they have to put the interest of the entity before anyone else. And you have to prove, should there be questionable decision 5 years down the line, you have to have proved as a board member that you have applied your mind on what was available to you, the decision that you have made. You've made a decision that was in the best interest of the company. You've perused your material, your board packs, you have applied yourself rigorously to a point where you are advancing the return on investment. But should you be found wanting, should you be found that you were not diligent enough, you did not apply yourself critically, you did not raise critical questions on some of these mega deals, you are likely to be criminally liable. And we've seen in private sector organizations, there's more and more evidence of board members. For an example, Stanford, some of the board members in Stanford are going to be criminally liable. For they have approved some of the deals which were dodgy, which suggests that they were not, or they failed to apply themselves in the way that they ought to. The other example is VBS. Some of the VBS board members and executives are now facing, because of the judgment rule provision in the Companies Act, are now facing criminal action for failing. So that measure forces individuals. If we have more and more board members that have been criminally charged for being negligent, it's going to somehow enhance professional outlook of board members, for they would know you don't get to that space and rubber stamp the decision of the chairperson, or rubber stamp the decision of the CEO, without yourself having to apply your mind based on evidence. I know it's very easier than said than done. We have instances where I would imagine company secretaries have raised issues to the chairperson, have raised issues against the CEO, but because they don't have power to make a decision, their role can only that of an advice. But you have to find a way where you record those kind of issues, that when investigations unfold, you would have said, listen, I raised these issues, I was uncomfortable, but I was overruled. In that way, the judgment rule provision of the Companies Act won't find you wanting, and you're likely to escape. So that's one thing that we could do. And it's also quite, it's definitely has to be applicable in the public sector as well. If you have made decisions without evidence and you costing the entity money, you have to be liable. You have to be criminally liable, because if you enter the space knowing exactly what are the consequences, the chances are you'll think twice. Yeah.
Thank you, Nimrod. I just want to, no, I think that explains a lot. And as you were speaking, I was thinking about, I see she's here, Janet Deprier did a master's with us last year on the context of wicked problems. And Janet, I was almost thinking, as Dr. Mbele explained to us, this is one of those wicked problems. Mulungisi, you had your hand raised. I don't see you in the audience. I'm not sure if you dropped out, but you wanted to ask a question or made a comment. No, I think Mulungisi dropped out. Nimrod, I think then that's it's very true what you've just said. So you're welcome to continue. We still have a few minutes. I will monitor the chat. I don't see new conversations coming up here. If there's somebody that wants to ask a question, now's also the time to raise the question to Dr. Mbele.
While we're at the prop, I'm not sure if I responded adequately to Professor, I think Ngoni, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah.
Yes.
If I responded adequately, or there's something that I still need to press, maybe.
Indeed, you have answered me more than adequately, Dr. Mbele.
Yeah.
And of course, when I ask questions to learn something out of that and to actually expand on what I've learned from you. And I'm very happy what I've gained from you. And thank you very much. The rest, in fact, it was merely a comment, but I'm glad that you turned it into a question also that is answerable in that context. But at least I've learned more than I have expected, that I would learn something from this. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Luna. So, Prof. Dr. Mbele, I almost get the sense what you're sharing with us, we need to start thinking differently about, how we think about governance and decisions, and almost in many ways you're challenging us to say we need to revolutionize the way we think about governance and how we mobilize people into that space. That for me is almost like a daunting question, but I think it is what it is, and you give us a lot of inspiration to do exactly that.
Absolutely.
Janet, I see you've got your hand raised. A follow-up question to Nimrod.
It was just a thought. Hello, Nimrod. Thank you. That's been really, really insightful. Thank you for your contribution, and love to see you again, Prof. I was just thinking in response to what you just said, this thing of governance, we focused a lot on the people who are in governance roles. From my own experience, I think one of the challenges sometimes is that the governance structures do not necessarily serve the kind of purposes that we're talking about this afternoon. For example, if the constitution that governs the behavior of the board does not support board development, does not support board accountability, it becomes very difficult to ensure that the board operates effectively, because the board is often an evolutionary group of people. What remains is the structures, and especially the constitution. And sometimes those constitutions are so badly written that it's almost impossible for board members to hold each other accountable.
Interesting observation there. In the main, I think it has to do with a solid leadership. Governance fall or fly at the back of solid leadership. If you do not have a very level-headed and competent chairperson of the board, if you do not have level-headed and competent chairperson of subcommittees of the board, it becomes very difficult for these structures, as you put them, to serve pretty much everyone. So you definitely need to have competent leaders, your board, your chairperson of the board. You also have to review from time to time, the governance instruments. For an example, the board charter. Every board needs to have a charter. That's number one. And every board needs to be subjected to internal and external assessment. If your board has not been evaluated by an independent authority, there's something wrong there. The board have to take initiatives to have internal assessment that says, are we meeting our target? Do board members come to meetings? Do the board members read their minutes? What's the level of conversation that is taking place? Is our conversation qualitative and quantitative? What has been the risk that the board has been able to do? So if boards subject themselves to that type of internal assessment, the board chairperson can now read and say, well, these are the gaps that we see. And if you have an external evaluation of the board, you're more likely to get even a better grasp or in the understanding of where the gaps are in the board, whether it's in the subcommittee level or even up to management. So it is important. The yardstick there is to subject the board to internal and external assessment, which also takes everybody, the chairperson, there has to be sets of questions around leadership, about coordination of the chairperson, and the chairperson of the committees, and the entire board, how the chairperson and the board. So if we don't have that validation, it's very difficult to get to a point where you've got the structure serves the purpose.
Yeah, and I also sometimes, if I may add to that, Dr. Mbele, over and above to what you've just said, I think people also don't always think about succession planning, because that also leads to a lot of disruption. So I think that's, for me, always one of the big challenges. And then the other one that I also, from my limited understanding of this, is, a lot of people fall back on King 4, not realizing that there's a different dispensation for non-profit boards to operate in a different environment, where it must almost you have a different mandate. And I think that come back to your question, how do you really live that mandate? And you think you might be good, but you need to have that outside in view, where you've got the review from external and say, you're not as smart as you think you are. What about this and this? Because as a board, we entrust you to put up the right hat and do the right thing for us, whether public or private, profit or non-profit driven.
Absolutely, Prof. Because I mean, because you also have to look at your issues such as diversity, in gender, because of our very unfortunate past in this country, we, part of transformation is to get women into boards, and it's to get Black people into boards. Some of them, they may have qualifications, but without experience. And it becomes very difficult for any person without experience to make a positive contribution in those kind of conversation. So that is why sound boards would have a mentorship program, as an example, that are meant for newly appointed board members, so that you're able to elevate the competency, you elevate the skills, you elevate the contribution of those individuals. Because if you don't have if you don't sequence your appointment with the kind of support that is needed, you will have people that rubber stamps, every decision that the CEO brings. Yeah. And when something soft and smelly hit the fan, and you wonder what happened, because you in some instances, in other entities, people are just deliberately allowed them not to fly, because it is easier for executive to sneak things in, because you don't want competent board members to be asking all sorts of questions. All you want as a chairperson, all you want as management in the main, is to have your ideas rubber stamped by the board. So there lies the role of the company secretary. They say, wait a second, part of our plan in this particular organization, we need to have a development program for newly appointed board members, so that we elevate the quality of the conversation, so that they can act with the diligence that is required. They can act with the sophistication that is required. If you don't do that, you only shortchanging yourself in the long run.
I love what you're saying, because I think for me, and I would love to get some views on that, but it's back to earlier comment on the redress, because in many ways, I always had the observation or the position that there are certain key values that drive the performance of a board, and you spoke about the fairness principle just now. I think we understand the transformation and inclusion principle, but you touched an important point of dignity, because that self and worth of the person doing the right thing, which for me, also start moving into the sustainability of the board and the real impact. It just become earlier somebody, I think Janet or you said, it's become a rubber stamp. That's where the concern sits. So I think you're underscoring the importance of what you've just said. Really love that.
Yeah, no, thanks. And I think ultimately, Prof, we all know that culture, trumps the strategy. You can have good strategies in place, good policies in place, good guidelines in place, but if you don't have a good organizational structure, organizational culture, that promotes individualism, that promotes team spirit, that promotes collaboration, that promotes, you know, a wholesome approach to hunting, because we're all hunting, you know. Then we are in big trouble. When you look at big entities such as Enroll, how they fail as an example, they you know, collaboration was never a currency, it was competition. When you compete to the detriment of the organization, you are really messing it up. But part of the organizational cult is that, yes, ultimately you as a person, you are accountable for XYZ, your work has been cut out for you, but you still have to collaborate with other people, bringing expertise. In that way, the whole collective, it's a win-win situation. But organizational cult, and that starts with the CEO. The CEO and an executive has to promote a culture of good performance, which lies in being open and in collaborating. You can compete, but you still have to collaborate. And if you begin to do those small bits and pieces, you are going to add value to your client, you're going to add value to your customer, you're going to add value to your shareholders, you're going to add value to pretty much everyone. That's my submission.
Yeah, and I would love to argue, and I thought about this many times in the past, you know, what you've just said, that symbiotic relationship between the chair of the board members, and the CEO and the exco of the company. You know, if they almost, you know, miss a beat somewhere and there's no trust, there's no common purpose, then, you know, in many ways, you know, you have a dysfunctional board, and that unfortunately is the reality. You mentioned the Stanford example earlier on. I think I would love to talk more, and I'm looking at the chat, and I see there's here and there's some comments, and I think they we echo that, and I don't see any hands. Maybe a last question, if I may allow. Janet, you've had your hand up for a while now.
No, it just came up now. Sorry, Prof, I'm back. You know, I always have an opinion on everything. But you know, something you said just now was so important. Patrick Lencioni's 5 dysfunctions of a team. The foundation is trust. So the first dysfunction is lack of trust. But what is so interesting in respect of what you just said is that lack of trust, in fact, prevents people from having healthy conflict, from being able to argue, from being able to call each other out. And that's such, you kind of said it in a different way, but I think that that's such an important point to raise. And I just wanted to add to what you said there.
Thank you very much, Janet. Dr. Mbele, a few last words of wisdom before we turn to Lita Curry.
I'm not sure if there's any words of wisdom from my head, but I must say I'm quite privileged to have been invited, and I sincerely hope we have all benefited from the kind of conversations that we have shared. And by no means, this is a very complex environment, and it evolves all the time. And the currency that really makes work, it's people. People. And if you are open and frank with your colleagues, you are likely to succeed. And if you treat people with respect, you know, in meetings, I've said in board meetings where either chairperson, when the chairperson is around, people are just quiet. In meetings, the CEO is there, nobody says a word. And, you know, we just have to, part of those assessments can bring those issues to the fore and say, you are not tapping into the intellect. You are not tapping into the world of information, insights, observations from these people who ordinarily would have given you an alternative view. But the culture is that of suppression. And people feel intimidated by yourself because they don't think they are worthy. So organizational culture is such an important item, You know, it doesn't matter whether people got PhDs, they've got this, and if you've got an overbearing manager, you know, whether you're a professor, you're a doctor, you can still keep quiet and say, wait, this is not my baby. You know, let's see where this will end. So it is important that you build trust. And out of trust, you build loyalty. You know, and if you don't bring trust, you breed disloyalty. People will sabotage you. And as that has happened.
Yes, very, very true. Mlungisi, I see you back. Can you maybe post your question there in the chat, because we're running out of time and we just need to wrap up the session. I would have loved to hear your question, but we can look at the chat and reply. But at this point, I want to turn to Lita Curry and ask Lita to summarize or play back to us what we've discussed here and what she's heard. Thanks, Lita.
Thank you, Prof, and good afternoon, everyone. Dr. Mbele, as you were talking, I was capturing in a combination of words and pictures the insights that I gained from your talk, and allow me to give you a very quick summary.
Sure.
Governance is complex and it's complicated. You spoke about that potjie course of governance when we get to that fractured governance type of idea. So it's really up to us to ask those difficult questions. If you think about the role of a board, they're there to provide direction and purpose. It's about shared value, not just stakeholder value. And it's not just about the bottom line. It's about everyone having a stake in terms of our stakeholders. But if we have these structures in place, why do things still go wrong? You spoke about Steinhoff. You spoke about Tongaat Hewlett. So how do we make sure that we don't fall into that trap? What's stood out clearly for me is that the board has to send a strong message to combat that culture of entitlement and really create the trust. Our boards must be made up of competent people who will take action based on meritocracy. So in terms of the action that we can take, we have to have the relevant risk processes in place. We have to have clear and transparent timelines, make decisions based on evidence, and bring redress into play. Conflict of interest is not just a form to fill in. It really is a live audit of executive lifestyles. Through background checks and a clear remuneration model, we should focus on competence and not just necessarily on race. Boards should prove that they have made the best decision with the information that they have available at the time, or they could be found criminally liable even later on. We have to start revolutionizing our thinking around this. The constitution that we have in organizations should allow for accountability. It comes down to strong, competent leaders, and we should review those charters very often. Our boards should be assessed internally and externally. We should continue to question the culture, and we should plan for succession continuously to make sure that it's not just a rubber stamp process. And that's the main insights that I got from your talk. It was fascinating. Thank you very much. Prof, back over to you.
Thank you, Lita. And, you know, I think that's just a great summary, Dr. Mbele, that we will share with you afterwards and also with the other members, as we always do. But I think if I listen to the conversation as you summarize it now, Lita, and based on the reflections that you shared with us, Dr. Mbele, I think I get a sense of excitement about the potential to revolutionize the way that we think about the practice of governance. And let me say that specifically. And you shared with us here today in a very practical terms how to think about governance to become more inclusive, to involve more people, to participate and to be collaborative. And I think this is what we need, you know, that the evidence that you spoke about. And by listening to you today, I think we're all reminded, and with this I want to conclude, that we're all reminded that yes, it's a complex and evolving concept. And, you know, it's complicated. But if we think about this idea of simplicity, it's in fact not that difficult. It's just, can we communicate that story? And that's not easier said than done. But what is in fact like a pole above water, there's no one-size-fits-all approach to implementing governance. And I think you've just opened up that discussion. And I want to thank you on behalf of all the DaVincians here today, the people that joined for the first time, our network, for making yourself available and sharing some insights. And believe me, this is not the last one. As you know, we are in discussions with Dr. Mbele for the rest of the group to have more of these discussions, because as a flag carrier, as ambassador to governance, I think there's much more that we need to tap in, and we need a mastermind like yourself, Dr. Mbele, to take us there. So thank you very much to you for sharing your thoughts here, for taking us through. and also to all the comments in the chats and the suggestions made. We appreciate. May you enjoy the rest of the afternoon. And our next mastermind is again the last Tuesday of the next month. I think that's the 27th of June. So you can watch the space. We will be in communication, and afterwards we will share that. And from my deepest heart, Dr. Mbele, thank you very much for your wisdom this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Prof. and colleagues. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. And Mulungisi, we will look at your comment there and we will get back with a comment to that. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, Nimrod.